This speaker is a really great speaker, but it has two faults for me. I was recently loaned a pair of the MoFi SourcePoint 10s for review direct from MoFi. Now, I was not paid for this review. I don't get any kickbacks or anything like that. No affiliate links, unless you use one of the generic affiliate links in my description below. But that's it. This speaker has been reviewed by some other outlets, and I'm going to be honest with you. I haven't watched a single one of them for a multitude of reasons, but one reason is because I don't want to be biased by anybody's particular point of view. So what you're going to get is all my thoughts, subjective, and you're going to see the objective data that I have that comes from my Klippel near-field scanner. To kick things off, I'm just going to go ahead and be upfront and say that this speaker is a really great speaker, but it has two faults for me. Number one, the bass doesn't go as low as I would like it to. The F3 anechoic is at about 50 hertz, and in room it gets down to about 40 hertz. Placement near a wall helps increase the bass, but too close a placement near a wall can also result in a little bit of a detriment to the mid-range because there's a wall bounce that will create a suck out in the mid-range area. And depending on how far the speaker is from the wall, that suck out can be anywhere from about 200 hertz to 500 hertz, give or take. So there's that trade-off of sacrificing a little bit of mid-range quality to get extra bass. I chose to simply not get the extra bass, pull the speakers out from the walls at about 2.5 feet because that's about really the most that I could afford space-wise in my room. The other thing that I didn't really care for was the top end is boosted when the speakers are facing on axis. But, like every coincident speaker that I have ever come across, these speakers were not designed to be pointed directly on axis. The reason for that is because there is a diffraction issue that comes from placing the speakers directly on axis with a coincident driver where the tweeter hits the housing and then the housing creates a little bit of a reflection and causes a cancellation or a peak or a series of both. And that's why what you do is you take the speaker and you just turn it off axis just a little bit. Let me show you what I'm talking about real fast. This is the raw drive unit, and I'm going to show you the tweeter housing. And you can see right there in the middle is the tweeter, and there's a little bit of a wave-guided housing. It's got a little bit of a slope. And that goes then into the cone, the mid-woofer cone. So that little bit of a slope, there's a little bit of an edge there, and that little bit of an edge creates a reflection point. At that reflection point, that's where you're going to get that diffraction, dip, or peak. And therefore, instead of having the speaker pointed directly at you like so, you take it and you turn it slightly, just a little bit off axis. How much do you turn it? Most concentric designs are intended to be turned about 10 to 15 degrees off axis. When you do that, you will alleviate that diffraction effect, but you'll also drop down the high frequency a little bit. And in talking to Andrew Jones, after I had done all my reviewing, so none of this was influential in my results, I asked him, hey, I noticed you've got a high frequency bump. Why do you have that? And he said, well, one thing, make sure you turn the speakers off axis slightly because they were not designed to be listened to on axis. But to answer the question specifically about the high frequency lift, that was done to kind of combat the narrowing of the high frequency in the tweeter. Every speaker beams, and as you go higher into the frequency that a particular speaker is playing, the more that the beaming starts to form. Now, typically at lower volumes, you're going to have omnidirectional sound, and as you go higher and higher, that omnidirectional starts to focus up, I should say, and point straight at you. This particular tweeter is a 28 millimeter dome tweeter. Most tweeters that you hear in pretty much every other speaker, I mean, by and large, are 1-inch tweeters or 25 millimeter tweeters. A 28 millimeter tweeter is going to beam a little bit more sooner and narrow up a little bit sooner in frequency than a 25 millimeter tweeter. So Andrew said in order to combat that, he lifted the treble up a little bit. So this treble lift will help combat the fact that you're going to be turning the speaker off axis slightly. And then it'll also give the speaker a little bit more top end because of the narrowing of the radiation pattern. However, in my listening, what I found was that even about 10 degrees was still a little bit too much on axis and the high frequency was a little bit too lifted. So typically what I did was I found that about 15 degrees off axis was probably the sweet spot. You can even go 30 degrees off axis if you want to, and that'll flatten out the top end, but that'll also create a little bit of a suck out in the crossover region. Now, having said all of that, I feel like I'm kind of nitpicking at this particular speaker, but these are two things that you're going to notice immediately if you're looking for a very neutral speaker. And because of that, you're going to have to take care in placement and in aiming of this particular speaker in order to get the best out of it that you possibly can. It's no different than any other speaker, but I want to note that because a couple people in my comments have already said, hey, I heard the speaker and it sounded a little bit bright. Now you know why. Turn it off axis a little bit more than before, and you should be okay. Additionally, what I try to do is I use my preamp to drop the treble down a little bit, and about 1 to 2 dB really help tame that high frequency even when the speaker is pointed on axis. So play around with the settings, play around with the aiming, play around with the physical location of the speaker in your room to get the best out of it. Those two things aside, the low frequency and the high frequency, this is a really great speaker, and frankly, it has the best sound power and early directivity indexes that I've seen out of any speaker so far, and it really is a true source point speaker or a point source speaker. That means that all the sounds originate from one point in space, and it comes straight from the speaker itself. In terms of output, I was actually really surprised at the dynamic capability of the speaker, even at low volume and at high volume. There really is little compression, and I was surprised because I know that a mid-range for a coincident driver, the cone isn't supposed to travel far. If it does, it creates intermodulation distortion, not the same type of IMD that you're used to, but a modulation as the waveguide moves that creates a modulation in the high frequency. Now, how audible is that? You're asking the wrong guy. I've asked the right people and I still haven't gotten a succinct answer. So we're going to table that one. And maybe one of these days I'll be able to come back to it with a good answer. But the point being is that regardless of how audible it can be, the designers generally try to keep excursion to a minimum on a waveguided cone. That also goes into why the speaker probably doesn't get as low as I wanted it to go. Because if we're going to play 30 hertz flat, well, you're talking about a lot of movement in this cone. And therefore, I really wasn't expecting a lot of dynamic range out of the speaker. Below about 50 hertz, that's when you start to run into issues. And you may actually still want to use a subwoofer. And if I were going to use these speakers on a daily basis, I think I'd probably go with a good sealed, maybe 10 or a 12 inch or a pair of 10s or 12s, just to help supplement the very bottom end of the speaker. That's kind of my subjective thoughts in a nutshell. So now let's kind of look at the data and see what the data shows us. All this data was provided via the Klippel near-field scanner, and that does a great job of allowing me to see what the speaker itself is doing. Doing that permits me the ability to actually analyze the data and understand how the speaker is likely to perform before I even have to put it into a room. And it allows me to tell you guys what happens when you listen to the speaker on axis versus off axis versus way off axis without trying to be too subjective or really just guesstimating at things. I can literally tell you objectively, this is what you can expect. Right now, we're looking at the CEA 2034 measurements of the speaker measured on axis. And this is my baseline. And we're going to talk about a couple things. Number one, see this dip right here? That goes away as you move off axis. Number two, see this high frequency treble elevation? That tames itself as you go off axis. I told you this speaker is designed to not be listened to directly on axis, just like pretty much every other coincident driver in the world. So I remeasure the speaker using a 10-degree horizontal plane as its reference point, and this is the result. As you can see, that dip I mentioned earlier, pretty much gone, and the high frequency lift is much more mitigated now. It's still there slightly, but it's much more tame now. And then overall, you have a more linear response. But the really cool thing about the speaker, and I hinted at it earlier, actually, I think I even flat out said it earlier, is the sound power directivity and the early reflections directivity. These things look pretty dang remarkable. There are some resonances that show up, and these are relative, I'm thinking maybe to potential port resonances. I seriously doubt that it's cabinet vibration just because of the cabinet construction. And let me show you what I'm talking about. The speaker weighs about 40 pounds. That little cone concentric driver weighs hardly nothing. So this sucker's pretty heavy, but you can see it's got a lot of packing material in there. And then behind it, it's got some bracing going on. So if I had to guess, I would say that these are port resonances. We might see a hint of that later on. But those things aside, overall, really good neutrality as long as you turn the speaker off axis. I know I'm hammering that. It's the last time I'm going to say it. I promise, at least maybe until the end. Overall sensitivity of the speaker is at about 88 to 89 dB, depending on where you're drawing your flat line at. But For me, my average is 300 hertz to 3 kilohertz, and it's about 88.2 dB, give or take. Switching over to linearity, you can get a better idea of how I took the average, and you can also see what the average is compared to the high frequency lift. So you can see that the high frequency lift is at about plus 1.5 to plus 3 dB, depending on exactly what frequency you're talking about. This is my average SPL at 88.2, F3 at 56 hertz, and F10 at 38 hertz. This is the horizontal radiation normalized to the on-axis response, and we can see that the speaker is at about plus or minus 50 degrees wide. This is the vertical, and you can see that vertical terms, it's about plus or minus maybe 30 to 40 degrees wide, depending on how high you're talking about in frequency, or specifically where you're talking about in frequency. But overall, the horizontal and the vertical look very similar. This is the compression data. As I said before, no real issues until you get to around 50 hertz. This is the distortion at 86 dB. Under 1% above about 100 hertz, and under 3% until about 40 hertz at 86 dB. And at 96 dB, under 3% up to about 100 hertz, and then below 100 hertz, it kind of just varies depending on the frequency. But overall, it's not really out of bounds of what I expected with a low excursion woofer like this. I'm actually kind of glad that it's not any higher than it is, if I'm being honest. Minimum impedance is at about 6.4 ohms, and then the average EPDR is at about 3 ohms. So most 4 ohm amplifiers should have no issue driving this speaker, and maybe 8 ohm amplifiers as well. But personally, I would just err to the side of caution, go with a 4 ohm amplifier. This is the step response of this particular speaker, and we can see that the tweeter comes in, and then it's followed by the mid woofer. This is blown up to give me a better idea of how far behind the woofer lags compared to the tweeter. So the cross cursor, and let's say the tweeter is at about 1.45 milliseconds. The woofer's peak is at about 1.833. So there's about, what is that? 0.4 of a millisecond delta between the tweeter and the mid woofer. I've never seen a coincident driver, a passive coincident driver, have exact time alignment between the tweeter and the mid woofer. The only way I've ever seen that happen is if the speaker is driven actively, and each tweeter and each midwoofer has its own amplification, and DSP is used to provide time alignment that way. That's the only time I've ever seen that. So I wouldn't get too bent out of shape saying, well, it's a coincident driver. Why doesn't it have the exact same time alignment? Show me one that does and prove it, because I've not seen it yet passively. I mentioned earlier that you could even turn the speaker about 30 degrees off axis, and when you do so, you'll drop that treble down, flatten it out, but you'll also suffer in the crossover region between the mid-range and the tweeter. And we'll see that in this data. So there's a little bit of a dip in that crossover region, a little bit of a dip, but we do have a more flat on-axis tweeter level. So that's going to be up to you. You're going to play around with aiming of the speaker and figure out what works best for you in your room. That wraps it up for this review. Just to recap, it's a very neutral speaker, but take care to place it not directly on axis, because when placed directly on axis, it is no longer a neutral speaker. There is a high frequency lift in the response, and I've seen others comment on it in various comment sections that they heard that at some show or another. So keep that in mind. I recommend 10 to 15 degrees off axis, and I really don't recommend going any further than that, because I think once you do, you compromise in other ways. I do also want to note that I initially had these speakers set up somewhat narrow, and then I widen them out. So I put them basically at the furthest extent that I possibly could, with about 11 feet between each speaker. And when I did that and I turned them about 15 degrees off axis, the soundstage blew up. Like, it got really, really big, but I didn't really lose any precision. So there was some little bit of an ambiguity there, but not a whole lot. Not as tight as a really narrow horn type speaker, but not as ambiguous as a dome tweeter on a flat baffle where the radiation pattern is still just too wide. So doing that, I think, is going to be the best bet. And with all of that said, I appreciate you watching. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them in the comment section below. Please leave a thumbs up. And if you haven't subscribed already, please consider doing that. Hit the notification bell so you'll be notified of future updates. Thank you to all my patrons who help support the channel, because there's a lot of stuff I have to go out and buy to test different speakers at various times. And those patrons allow me to do so at less of a cost to me. And frankly, it just helps support what I'm doing, and I really appreciate that. If you want to support in other ways, generic affiliate links in the comments below. Feel free to do whatever you want, buy anything you want, speakers, underwear, soap, shampoo, toothbrush, I don't care. Just, keep that in mind when you're buying stuff. That helps out a lot as well, because every little bit does count. I will talk to you all later. Take care. Peace.